The Senate will come to order. Mr. Panetta, will you please call the roll?
Bridges. Buckner. Coleman. Cook. Quorum. Danielson.
Excused.
Donovan. Fenberg. Fields. Gardner. Janal. Gonzalez. Hanson. Heisey. Heisey. Heisey.
No, Senator Heisey present.
Holbert. 113. Hawkins Lewis. Kirkmeyer. Colker. Lee. Liston.
Here.
Lundeen. Moreno. Pedersen.
Here.
Priola. Rankin. Rodriguez. Scott. Thought it was supposed to be remote. Scott.
Excused.
Simpson.
Here.
Smallwood. Sonnenberg. Story.
Here.
Winter.
Here.
Woodward.
Here.
Zenzinger. Mr. President.
Here. With 33 present, 0 absent, and 2 excused, we have a quorum. Senator Coleman, will you please lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
Thank you, Mr. President. Members and guests, please join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God,
Indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Approval of the journal. Senator Cook.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move the reading of the journal for Friday, January 14th, 2022 be dispensed with and the journal be approved as corrected by the Secretary.
You have heard the motion. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the motion is adopted. Senate Services.
January 18th, correctly printed, Senate Bills 38, 39, 40, 41, 42, 43, 44, SJR 2, SM 2, currently revised, correctly revised, HJR 1003.
Consideration of memorials. Will the clerk please read the title to Senate Memorial 001?
Senate Memorial 001 by Senators Coleman and Gonzalez, memorializing Congress to adopt comprehensive voting rights legislation to protect the integrity of the American democracy and the sacred right to vote.
Senator Coleman.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move SM001 and ask to be read at length.
Mr. Panetta, will you please read Senate Memorial 001 at length?
Senate Memorial 001 by Senators Coleman and Gonzalez, memorializing Congress to adopt comprehensive voting rights legislation to protect the integrity of American democracy and the sacred right to vote. Whereas every January, we honor the memory of Dr. Martin Luther King and his heroic efforts to advance voting rights, and we aspire to follow in his footsteps. And whereas no one did more to promote the right to vote for disenfranchised Americans than the civil rights leaders of the 1960s, including Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Congressman John Lewis, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Alla Baker. And whereas, until the United States Congress passed the Federal Voting Rights Act of 1965, people of color in the United States were frequently subject to poll taxes, literacy tests, and fraud and intimidation, preventing them from exercising their right to cast a ballot. And whereas the United States Senate is considering critical federal elections reform and long overdue updates to the Federal Voting Rights Act of 1965 to preserve voting rights for generations to come in honor of the legacy of the late Congressman John Lewis. And whereas Colorado's electoral system serves as an example to the rest of the nation, and in fact the world, of how to expand voter access while protecting electoral integrity through safeguards including risk-limiting audits and signature verification. And whereas in the 2020 election, Colorado had the second highest voter turnout of any state in the nation, and Colorado's largest voting bloc, young people ages 18 to 34, turned out in record numbers. And whereas efforts to suppress the vote and disenfranchise Americans who historically have had the least access to the ballot have been on the rise across the country in recent years. And whereas last year, more than 440 bills with provisions that restrict voting access were introduced in 49 states, including here in Colorado, where legislation was introduced to restrict voters' access to Colorado's vote-by-mail system, a national model of excellence for election access, security, and integrity. And whereas last year, 19 states passed 34 laws restricting access to voting, including Georgia's Senate Bill 202 and Texas Senate Bill number 1, both of which made it more difficult for voters to exercise their fundamental right to vote enshrined in the United States Constitution and the Federal Voting Rights Act of 1965. And whereas falsehoods and conspiracies regarding the integrity of the 2020 election have run rampant in our media and public's discourse. And whereas the months-long coordinated attempt to interfere with the democratic process following the November 2020 election and prevent the peaceful transfer of power by overturning the legitimate results of the presidential election, which culminated at the United States Capitol on January 6, 2021, serves as a violent reminder of the fragility of our democracy. Now, therefore, be it resolved by the Senate of the 73rd General Assembly of the State of Colorado that we, the members of the Colorado Senate, 1, reassert the validity of the 2020 presidential election results as legitimate and verified. 2, offer Colorado's premier electoral system as a model for states across the country to adopt in order to increase voter participation while ensuring electoral integrity. And 3, call on the United States Congress, and specifically members of the United States Senate, to pass comprehensive voting rights legislation to protect the fundamental right to vote, which has been the cornerstone of our democracy since the founding of our republic. Be it further resolved that copies of this memorial be sent to the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, the Majority Leader of the United States House of Representatives, the Minority Leader of the United States House of Representatives, the President of the United States Senate, the Majority Leader of the United States Senate, the Minority Leader of the United States Senate, and all members of the Colorado Congressional Delegation.
Mr. Panetta, will you please mark Senator Woodward excused? Senator Coleman.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, please take your seats. This resolution urges Congress, and specifically the U.S. Senate, to pass comprehensive voting rights legislation to protect the fundamental right to vote, including the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and the Freedom to Vote Act. It also affirms our commitment to defending democracy, and it lifts up Colorado's voting system as a model for states across the country to adopt in order to increase voter participation while ensuring electoral integrity. We urge passage of this resolution because the right to vote is sacred, and it is under attack. This is a question that we usually ask here in the legislature when a bill or anything is being proposed. Why is this necessary? You heard on page 2, lines 17 through 21, that 19 states passed 34 laws restricting access to voting last year. including Georgia Senate Bill 202 and Texas Senate Bill number 1, both of which made it more difficult for voters to exercise their fundamental right to vote. Colorado's voting system, as you also heard, is one of the best in the world, and it serves as a shining example to other states on how to run fair, safe, and secure elections. That's why we're holding it up for others to see. Colorado routinely has amongst the highest voter participation in the country, and that's something we should be proud of. But this resolution is about our caucus affirming our commitment to defending democracy and an opportunity to do what we can to spur action to protect the right to vote across this country. We urge your support.
Is there further discussion? Senator Fields.
Good morning, Mr. President and colleagues. Thank you all for this opportunity to speak on this Senate Memorial 001. I want to thank the two Senate sponsors for bringing this to our attention. I stand in strong support of 001. Why? Just read the title. It's to protect the integrity of America, of American democracy, and the right to vote. It's that simple. It's that clear. Yesterday, I had the honor to participate in the 37th Martin Luther King Jr. Parade. Thousands of people showed up for the parade. Those who attended was a reflection of the Colorado pioneer spirit and reflection of what Colorado looks like. We had Black folks there, Latinx, seniors, children, disabled people, LGBTQ people. Our youth were there. Our allies were there. The community showed up. Businesses showed up. And institutions showed up. I'm talking about higher ed and also public schools, maybe some charter schools were there. But in their message, when they talked to the crowd, it was all about a plea to make sure that we protect action as relates to voting rights in the United States. It was truly amazing because we're not post-COVID yet. We're still in the middle of COVID, but yet we had people there to celebrate the life and the legacy and the man of Dr. Martin Luther King. So who was there? It started out with Jared Polis. Jared Polis was there, and he took the baton. It's almost like being at the Olympics. So at the beginning of the parade, we have these runners, and they have this baton, and they pass it on to the next person. And then that governor gives it to the next commissioners that's going to do the baton and the running again. It's a symbol that has been going on forever. If you don't know about the Colorado Martin Luther King Commission, it is a nonprofit, and it's funded by donors. We started out with prayers from all different religions and faiths. But this one prayer I remember the most. And this prayer was done by a rabbi. And the rabbi talked about one of the rabbis that were marching with King way back when. He passed away, he said, about 2 weeks ago. And he asked him, what was it like to march with Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King? And he said this, and it's cemented in my mind. He said, with every step I took, it was like I was praying. And he compelled each of us, as we marched down Colfax to Civic Center Park, he asked us to pray in peace and making sure that every step that we walked, that we were praying. Very, very powerful statement. Of course, there were a lot of elected officials there. We had U.S. Senator Michael Bennet. We had U.S. Senator John Hickenlooper. We had our congressmen there. We had Jason Crow and Joe Neguse. They were there. And they also challenged us to make sure that we do everything possible to protect the right to vote and do exactly what this Senate memorial speaks about. Of course, we had the architects that were there. The architects behind the passing of the Martin Luther King Day holiday in the state of Colorado. I call them our elders. We had Wellington Webb, former mayor, there, and then we also had his wife, former state representative Wilma Webb was there, and she spoke, and she talked about the successful passing of that legislation and what it took. She talked about the perseverance, the determination, and the struggle to deal with rejection when it failed so many times. But today, it passed in I think it was 84, it passed. And we're still celebrating the life and the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. It was also wonderful to see my colleagues that were there in the House and the Senate. So in closing, I just want to refer to one statement that we've been hearing all across the nation as it relates to what's going to take place down in Congress this week is voting. I don't know what the turnout is going to be, but I know that we all believe in protecting the right to vote. And I think my colleague from Denver mentioned what we do here in the state of Colorado, because we have one of the safest election processes you can have. I've been down here since 2011, and I can remember when there was concern about an all mail-in ballot. We have an all mail-in ballot. So the clerk and recorder of Denver also spoke. He did a wonderful job. And he also talked about how easy it is to access the right to vote in the state of Colorado. First of all, you get your ballot in the mail. You can decide to put a stamp on it. And if you don't want to put a stamp on it, you can take it to a drop box. And in Denver, they have 43 drop boxes. So if you didn't want to put the stamp on it, you could just take it to a drop box. I don't know how many you have in your community, but what he said is he looked at where there were areas where there were gaps and discrepancy where they didn't have a drop box. And he was targeted and he was specific about where those drop boxes should be. You can register in the state of Colorado at 16 to be ready and prepared to vote when it's your time. He talked about the voting for felons. He talked about how you could go do same-day registration and vote. So if you didn't want to mail it, and you didn't want to drop it off, then you can take it into a polling station. Some people still like to do that. They want to make sure that, you know, it's taken and someone sees them taking that, their ballot in, and some people even like the sticker. Now, I represent Arapahoe County, and the sticker I get comes in the mail when I get my ballot. So I can still get the sticker and don't have to worry about going in there. But it is very convenient, and it's very fair, and it's very accessible. And I would like to see us do everything possible to maintain that process that we have here in the state of Colorado. And I'm hoping that other states will adopt the same criteria that we have here in the great state of Colorado. Thank you, colleagues, for this Senate memorial. And please vote yes on Senate Memorial 22001.
Senator Hansen.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Colleagues, I am proud to support this resolution, and I have a short story I wanted to share with you this morning. I had a chance in 1999 to spend the year studying engineering in South Africa. And I was at university in Johannesburg, and I was lucky to be there during the second free election that South Africa had had after apartheid fell. So join me for a moment at a campaign rally for the ANC in 1999. Think about that for a moment. The main speaker was Nelson Mandela. It was a small crowd. One of the things that Nelson Mandela was super good at was campaigning in places even when he knew most of the people weren't on his side. Small crowd, a couple hundred people max. And I showed up early, chance to talk to people, chance to see President Mandela. And he spoke that day, obviously in support of their presidential candidate, Thabo Mbeki, in the 99 election. But he talked about free and fair election for the entire country. So now rewind to 1950. Apartheid regime wins the 48 election. What's the first thing they do? They restrict the right to vote. 80% of the population of South Africa could not vote from 1950 to 1994. Top priority of the apartheid government was restrict the right to vote. We cannot move backwards in the United States of America on this issue. Cannot. History's lessons on access to the ballot are too strong. This republic does not survive if we move backwards. My inspiration from my year in South Africa was first, talk to folks even if they don't agree with you. It was the powerful lesson of Nelson Mandela. And his life's work was to make sure that every single person in South Africa could vote. That was the change we saw in '94. That was the change he was continuing to fight for in 1999. That is our charge today. That is why this resolution is so important. We collectively, in a bipartisan way, have put in place the gold standard for ballot access in the state of Colorado. The gold standard. Yet we are seeing state after state go backwards on this issue. It will not happen in Colorado. That's what this memorial says today. But going further, we're making a clear statement to the rest of the nation. We will not stand by silently while forces act to restrict the right to vote. It's unacceptable, and I urge you to support this resolution and memorial.
Senator Donovan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, colleagues. I too rise in support of the memorial that we just heard read at length, and I appreciate the shared stories and experience of the colleagues this morning. Of course, we all have such high esteem and value for voting rights. Otherwise, I'm not sure that many of us would make the sacrifices we do to sit in this chamber. And Colorado enjoys some of the safest and trusted elections in the country, a theme of today, while also being able to maximize access to the ballot. It was policy passed under a Republican Secretary of State and continued under a Democratic Secretary of State, endorsed bipartisanly by clerks across the state, and indeed protected, upheld, and defended by clerks across the state that on election day let that party letter fall away. The voice of every Coloradan being heard is fundamental to a working republic. I think that much we should all agree on. The resolution deserves the support from this entire chamber for that very reason. It simply states that we as bipartisan representatives of our communities believe that Colorado's elections were valid, safe, and fair. What a wonderful thing to be able to declare and believe and champion. 19 states have gone the other way, though, restricting voter access and making it less safe to vote. The federal government needs to act now. Hear our voice from Colorado and pass legislation that gives other states the opportunity to do what Colorado has led on, increasing voter participation access to the ballot for everyone, left, right, or center, while also having one of the more secure elections in the entire country. Conspiracy theorists, ideologues, and misinformation are powerful weapons against democracy. And the fact that people in just a few short years go from champion American democracy to questioning American democracy shows the power of misinformation. And it shows the need for our federal elected representatives to double down and push against these false narratives that have recently caught fire. And we cannot celebrate Dr. King's birthday while standing idly by. We heard that loud and clear this weekend, that you cannot just tweet, that you cannot just give a speech, that you cannot just show up on a holiday and post a picture of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. while not acting on the very things that he and others have fought for. These weapons against democracy, these acts in other states that we have seen to devalue our belief in the ability to vote and what those vote means when they are counted fair and freely, we must work against it. We must act, and the federal government must act too. The voice of every citizen being heard in an election is the fundamental concept of our republic. Indeed, it is one of the rights that we decided was worth fighting for. It is why we decided to become a nation. To rule ourselves, not have one voice elevated above all others, to not have one ideology elevated above all others. We, the people. That we doesn't exist if access to the ballot is restricted. That we doesn't exist if access to the ballot is restricted, if it's revised, if it's reduced, if it's reimagined. There is no we when we start kicking people out of voting lines or even refusing them water. There is no we when we restrict access to the ballot in significant or minor ways. Rather, we must get rid of long voting lines altogether and those other aspects on voting day that may prevent someone from having their voice heard. We need to do across the nation what we have done in Colorado. What a remarkable thing to champion. So I hope that we can send a strong message, again, a unified voice. That same unified voice that put these remarkable laws into place, we should send that same unified voice to DC to celebrate Colorado's best and safest in the nation election system. And the Senate, far away in DC, must act. They must act now, and they must pass voting rights legislation.
Senator Story is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President, and good morning, colleagues. It's an honor to have an opportunity to speak about this memorial this morning, and I stand in support of it as several others have already done. Equal access to voting is crucial to our democracy. This idea permeates what it means to be an American, the guarantee of free and fair elections, the ability to voice your opinion and be an active participant in our democratic process. Right now, we cannot confidently say that this is possible for every American. Many are making it harder for communities of color and youth to make their voices heard at the ballot box. This is not something we can stand by and watch play out. We are here today at the consideration of our constituents. The very least we can do is make sure that they can vote and get to that ballot box. Today, we are urging Congress and the US Senate in particular to pass comprehensive voting rights legislation that will protect the fundamental right to vote, including the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and the Freedom to Vote Act. Unfortunately, many state legislatures are taking radical steps to curtail voting access for communities of color and our youth. For example, they are working to eliminate same-day voter registration, limit mail-in voting and early voting, and cut staff and hours at polling places. This issue is not partisan. It's American. Ensuring that every American can exercise their right to vote is something that should unite us, not divide us. It is only together as a body of one people that we can fully call ourselves a democracy. That includes the equal access to voting. As one of the best voting systems in the country, right here in Colorado, with some of the highest voter participation, we stand as a model for how to run fair, safe, secure, and most importantly, democratic elections. Our beautiful state has some of the safest elections in the nation, thanks to our safeguards to protect against double voting, including signature verification and laws on ballot collection. This is only one of several layers of verification and protection of our votes. Perhaps the most important element, though, is giving every Coloradan equal opportunity to make that vote. And these systems have been put in place with bipartisan efforts. However, Colorado is only one of 50 states, and it is our duty to commit as a nation to this goal. With this resolution, not only can we be an example, but we can reaffirm our commitment to democracy and to protect the sacred right to vote across the country. We are one body, one people, with the freedom to voice our millions of different voices through fair, secure, safe, and democratic elections. We just need to make sure each American equally has that opportunity. Let's all stand in unity this morning to pass this memorial in support of protecting the integrity of American democracy and the sacred right to vote. Thank you.
Further discussion? Senator Buckner.
Thank you, Mr. President. I stand in strong support of Senate Memorial 22-001. On the heels of this Martin Luther King weekend, I had many thoughts to reflect. And one of the most important reflections I had was the right to vote. It's hard to believe that in 2022, that we are talking about the right to vote. The right to vote is sacred, as I was taught by my grandmother, Ely Payne. She was an uneducated Black woman in Kentucky, and in order to vote, she had to walk miles to get to a place where she could vote. And then when she got there, they were asking her so many questions that she could not answer. Do you know the entire Constitution by heart? No, she didn't. And they would ask her so many other questions that were unnecessary, but she had to answer those in order to vote. I can hear her in my ear right now telling me, Janet, no matter what you have to do, you have to protect the right to vote. Too many people before us sacrificed their lives in order for us to be able to vote. I used to go to the voting polls with my mother and my father. To tell you how important it was to go to vote, we would get dressed up in our Sunday best because that's how important it was to be able to vote. My mother said, you go with pride. You look presentable when you go to vote. And here we are in 2022 talking about the right to vote. Access is crucial. My grandmother, Ely Payne, wishes she didn't have to walk 2 miles to get to the voting polls. Having access to vote for those who are not as fortunate as some of us to have the hours at work to be able to leave to go to vote. Colorado has one of the best voting systems in the world and the country. We know how to run fair, safe elections. I have friends from all over the country who call me to tell me, I wish we had it like you have it in Colorado. I want us to defend our democracy. I want us to protect our right to vote. And I want to make sure that Washington, D.C. receives our message of how important this is. And I, as a legislator, and all of you as legislators, should be proud to protect the right to vote. So once again, I stand in strong support of this important memorial. Lest we forget, we cannot forget.
Will the clerk please add Senator Scott to the roll call? Mr. Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. This memorial starts out with, of course, a reference to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which we all know we celebrated his life and his work and the work of many others this past weekend. When we think of Dr. King, we think of his dream. That's probably the first message that we receive when we learn about him in grade school. And I think today there's no question that that dream we have still not reached, and there is still so much more work to do for his dream to come true. We've made progress in many areas, of course. I think this moment in American history is an unfortunate reminder that there is more work to do to reach that dream. Similarly, I think what we saw in Texas over the weekend was another example of that, where a group of people worshiping in their way welcomed someone who worships in a different way to join them, offered them some tea to get out of the cold, and it quickly turned into something else and turned violent. That is a small example, we saw it on the news, but it's a small example of how the dream has not come to light just yet. There is more work to do. We don't all live together and coexist. We don't all have the same clean air to breathe. We don't all have the same access to our democratic process. I think the work that we have seen all over this country in recent years to restrict the right to vote, to remove drop boxes or ballot boxes, or to say your vote doesn't count if you voted by mail, I think is another stark example of how much there is still to do to reach that dream that Dr. King had. We are seeing these restrictions come up. And even after those restrictions are put into law around the country, we see more policies moved forward. That maybe it doesn't say who can vote, but it says who counts the vote once that election is complete. I think we have never seen a more dangerous attack on our democratic process in modern times than what we have seen play out before us over the last few years. I think Colorado has an incredibly important role to play, even if those attacks are not happening within our borders, because we have learned so much over the years about how to run elections, how to make sure they're safe, accessible, and secure. And we have lessons that others, we hope, can learn from, and that's what this is about. We have figured out how to do it well. It's not to congratulate ourselves and pat ourselves on the back and say that there isn't more work to do, there isn't more that we can do. There is. That's what democracy is about. You never reach the perfection, you never reach the end, but you continue to improve it and make it more perfect. I hope there is one thing that we can all agree on in this chamber. Obviously, we are early on in the session, and we will disagree on a lot of things this year. A lot of issues we will have different opinions on. Maybe some of us don't think they're a true problem that needs to be solved, or we just have different ways of getting there to solving the problem. But I hope that there is one thing that we all can agree on. and that is democracy works best when more people participate. And that's true all over the country, not just in Colorado. I think we all agree and have worked in different ways towards making that a truism in Colorado. But when folks have their right to vote restricted anywhere in the country, it impacts us because it means that the election system, our democracy, is not as pure and is not as accessible and fair as it could be. And that dilutes the vote of everybody. I hope we can all agree today that we need Congress to act. And I hope that other states and Congress can learn from a lot of the lessons we've learned over the years as we've gotten to the election system that we have on the books here today. I hope we can all agree that voting rights are civil rights and that there's a lot more work that needs to be done to make that true across the country. And I hope we can agree today that this is a small step we can take, a small message to ask the rest of our country to follow in our steps and to make sure that voting rights are protected as civil rights for everybody. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also rise in support of this resolution and endorse the statements and comments made by my colleagues, particularly acknowledging how successful Colorado has been in implementing a system which makes voting readily accessible. We did a lot of things with registration, with vote centers to open up the amount of time that people have to get to vote. We have made access to voting easy with ballot boxes. I remember when I was a kid, my parents used to take me to the voting booth with them and sit me up on it and let me pull the lever or put the stylus through the ballot to mark the vote. They had one day to do it, and they had to go in after work or before work, typically after work, to do it. But now we have a couple of weeks where people can engage in this process, and it works. We've shown the country how it can work. So why would states and folks around the country try to restrict access to the ballot? What is the reasoning? What is the purpose behind it? And I leave you to consider that question. Why do people want to limit the right to vote? And where do they direct those efforts to reduce the right to vote? The system, what we are being told is to protect the integrity of the system, to prevent voter fraud, to prevent people coming in and who are not registered to vote, to come in and vote. Well, I would suggest that the voter fraud argument is in fact a fraud itself. I Googled this morning the voter fraud and looked up the Brennan Center, part of the New York Law School, New York University Law School, and briefly they have compiled basically a meta-analysis of studies of voting fraud all across the country, and just over the past 8 years there have been 16 major studies of voter fraud, and they have basically found that voter fraud is a myth. And not to get too down into the details, but in one report they found that most reported incidents of voter fraud are traceable to other sources such as clerical error. Columbia University tracked incidents of voter fraud for 2 years and found that rare fraud was reported traced primarily to false claims by a loser in a close race, mischief, and administration or voter error. The Washington Post found 31 credible instances of impersonation fraud between 2000 and 2014 out of 1 billion votes cast. 31 credible instances, on and on. In 2012, assessment of Georgia's 2006 election found no evidence that election fraud was committed under the auspices of deceased registrants. So let's bring it home to Colorado. I worked on the voter integrity unit, and I've been an election judge to see how the process works. What we do in Colorado, in fact, is we audit our elections. We have risk limiting audits to ensure that the ballots that were cast are correlated precisely with the votes that were the actual paper ballots. And it works. And we did it in El Paso County. I met with the Republican clerk and recorder, Chuck Browerman, and he described the successful audit of the elections in El Paso County, and he said no fraud whatsoever. So claims of imposing limitations and restrictions such as photo IDs are not designed to limit voter fraud. There are ulterior motives to doing that. In fact, my mother-in-law, 78 years old, did not have an ID. If she'd had it, she had misplaced it, no way that she could have found it. We had to actually take her down to the voting polls and bring all sorts of proof, but we had the capability to do that. A lot of people, elderly people, people of color, do not have the capability to come up with photo IDs. So the requirement to have photo IDs is really a solution looking for a problem and a pretext to limit voting. As we have all come out in support of the Martin Luther King resolution celebrating his birthday, we need to support the principles that he lived for and actually died for. So I urge support of this resolution, and I urge Congress to adopt the John Lewis Voter Act. Thank you.
Senator Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, it's an honor to be here with you all this morning, and I rise in support of this resolution. We've heard a number of stories this morning, and I want to share one more with you, actually two more with you. The first from when I was a young little chicanita, 21 years old, and I participated in the 2004 New American Freedom Summer, which commemorated the 40th anniversary of the Freedom Rides that were organized to try to ensure access to the ballot. It was a transformative experience for me. I remember being trained by Hollis Watkins, a name that you may not know, but in Mississippi, his work was foundational. He was a son of sharecroppers, the 12th son, the youngest son of sharecroppers, and he was trained by Medgar Evers and Bob Moses. And in 1964, when the decision around whether or not to bring Northerners down in buses to help register people to vote in the state of Mississippi was first being discussed, he initially opposed the idea because he said, no, we should be doing our own work. But once the decision was made, he actively supported the Freedom Summer. You all may remember that Freedom Summer, those freedom rides, led to the deaths of four Americans. And so to be trained as a young woman by him in 2004, I remember him saying, like, I'm thankful to be old enough to have participated in the 1964 project, and I'm proud to be young enough for this one. Being able to then spend that summer both in Mississippi and then in Arizona, the state where I was born, registering voters, talking to people about the power that the vote can have to improve their lives and the status of their community. Changed my life. I want to fast forward and tell you another story. A story that I just learned here over the Christmas holiday. My family got together, and one of my little baby cousins, who has now graduated college and started her new life, she moved to Virginia. And she voted there for the first time. Actually, she voted for the second time, but she voted for the first time in Virginia. And she talked to me about how confusing it was, how difficult it was to register, the fact that she had to go and stand in lines in order to be able to cast her ballot. She said, why would people do that? Why, gosh. And we had this big long conversation about how easy it was and how she had never even realized that other states still had these barriers. And so for folks like Hollis Watkins, who still today is doing the work through Southern Echo to educate people about the work done a generation ago and the work that still continues today, I'm proud of the work that we have done here in this state to create a gold standard election system. But that system is under attack. And states across the country, like Mississippi, like Georgia, like Texas, where I went to high school, are moving forward policies designed to target and disenfranchise voters. Voters who look like my little baby cousin. Voters who look like me. So the work continues. And so today, I'm honored to bring forward this resolution alongside my colleague, the good senator from the northeast side of Denver. And Mr. President, once again, I move Senate Memorial 001, and I ask for a roll call vote.
Leader Holbert, that is a proper motion, but Leader Holbert is recognized before the motion proceeds.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, members, thank you for the conversation. I'd like to explain some perspectives that I have on Senate Memorial 001. Where it starts off, every January we honor the memory of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his historic efforts to advance voting rights, and we aspire to follow in his footsteps. Yes. Whereas no one did more to promote the right to vote for disenfranchised Americans than the civil rights leaders of the 1960s, including Dr. Martin Luther King, Congressman John Lewis, Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker. Yes, I'm just old enough to remember those days, born in '61, having a very politically active, attentive family. I can't say I'm an expert, but yes, I remember those days. Whereas until the United States Congress passed the Federal Voting Rights Act of 1965, people of color in the United States were frequently subject to poll taxes. Ooh, no. I mean, yeah, yes, they were, and no, I can't stand for that. No. Oh. Literacy tests. No. And fraud and intimidation. No, we can't accept that. Preventing them from exercising their right to cast a ballot. That is all something I can vote for. That is correct. We stand in unison, I believe. Where the memorial causes me pause, there's a few things. But those of us who have been here in the General Assembly for, 8 years or so, or 10 or 12 or more, from my friend from Sterling. You might remember if you served here in the legislature in 2013 and 14, there were two bills that received a lot of debate during those years. The first was all mail ballot voting. Now, it's not specifically true to say all mail ballot. I think that about 5% typically, statistically, about 5% of voters in Colorado do not use mail ballot and go fill out a ballot at a polling place. And that's still an option. But that was a bill, I believe in 2013, that I and others in my caucus back in the House argued for hours against. And one of the things that I opposed about that bill was the idea that we would send a live ballot out to people who don't actually live at an address and rely on return undeliverable, return back to the post office, and then the post office taking those ballots back to the county clerk and saying, these came back undeliverable. Now, those of us who run for office, if you've been out walking door to door, I've experienced this. Have you ever met someone who says, that person doesn't live here anymore? And I told the people who came to my door last year or 2 years ago, that person didn't live here then either. Have any of you experienced that? Because I have. And I have contacted the county clerk in Douglas County or wherever I might be walking at the time. I said, hey, Fred Flintstone. I went to this door and it said Fred Flintstone was registered to vote at that address, and the people who live there said they've said over and over again, year after year, Fred doesn't live at that address. Is there something you can do to verify that? And as I understand, our state law requires one way to remove Mr. Flintstone or whoever that voter might be from our rolls. That ballot has to come back undeliverable, and it has to happen multiple times. So what happens if a homeowner, a resident, someone's renting an apartment, and they get a ballot for Fred or anybody else? Do you think they take that ballot and write on their undeliverable return to sender? Sometimes they do. Do you think anybody might take that ballot and throw it in the trash can? Or on a mail counter in an apartment complex or a condominium, a townhouse complex? Do you think that ever happens? I do. And if that ballot doesn't get back to the county clerk and into the system as undeliverable, it never triggers the system. And I raised those issues. I know my friends who were here in 2013 raised that issue. And it still exists. But that's the minor issue. I mean, that's a big issue. That's a big deal for me. But when people, like in the 2020 elections, ask, well, do you trust the system in Colorado? I was like, I have the same two concerns now that I did back in 13 and 14. The delivering the live ballots out to people who don't actually live there and trusting in the return ballot thing, that's one. But the one that really gets me, and same-day voter registration. I guess at this point I can say I can support that, but the way we do it here, if you weren't here in the General Assembly at that time, do you know? Because, gosh, I remember this. In order to register to vote, all you have to do is go in and claim intent. I intend to live here. And then you're given a live ballot. Now, when I get to page 3, this is, be it resolved we, the members of the Colorado Senate, we get to paragraph parentheses 2, lines 3 through 5, offer Colorado's premier electoral system as a model for other states across the country to adopt in order to increase voter participation while ensuring electoral integrity. How can I vote yes for that when I had those same two positions on sending out live ballots to people who don't actually live there and being able to register based on a statement of intent? Now, we have at least 2 attorneys in the chamber. I appreciate you both, count you both as friends, but I'm not as eloquent and able to speak to how nearly impossible it is to prove intent in a courtroom. But as a layperson, non-attorney, I understand it's pretty darn close to impossible. So do I want to vote yes on a memorial, which, by the way, isn't law? This doesn't propose state law for Colorado. This doesn't change anything. This, in my opinion, really is a formal advocacy letter to Congress, especially the United States Senate. So, do I want to vote yes on something that I think in some people's eyes would say Senator Holbert is endorsing everything about the Colorado electoral process? The process to register to vote, the process of voting, because that wouldn't be true. Now, I'm also here to say that I have found reason to appreciate and trust our voting system because, as I've mentioned before, I'm one of 3 current members of the minority, Republicans, who've been in the General Assembly for the past 12 years, and I've been in the majority for half of that time, 6. I think my good friend from Montrose is a few months behind, a session behind when Senator Roberts, I think, resigned. But you know, I have celebrated on election nights 3 cycles, 2010, 2014, and 2016. It was like, yes! So I encourage people, over the past years, people have contacted me, and I'm sure you've received hundreds, maybe thousands of those letters too. My encouragement has been, where do you live? What county do you live in? Do you know your county clerk? If you live in Douglas County and you have concerns about elections, do you know Douglas County is clerked by the one clerk, I think, who said no to one company that people have a real hard time with. But if one clerk said no, can't others? But get to know your clerk. But when people ask, do you just trust the system implicitly? I say, no, I still have the same 2 concerns that I did in 13-14. Sending out live ballots to people who don't actually live there. What happens to those ballots? Trusting the resident there to mark their return, this person doesn't live here, triggering that system. I know it works sometimes, but there was a person who lived in my neighborhood who moved out of state. And he kept coming up, not on walk lists from the parties, but the voter rolls from the county. And I asked, is there anything, this person doesn't live here anymore. I know this person. I could give you his address in the other state. And the answer was no. Got to have the ballot come back. And that other thing, is there any data to show how many people go in and get a ballot and say they intend to live there? I don't think we're allowed to know. That's not a provisional ballot, that's a live ballot, and it's all based on a statement of intent, which I aggressively, ardently opposed. And if it didn't exist, then maybe I could say, yeah, use our election system as a model, but it does exist. So I can't. It is frustrating being in the minority because I don't get to decide everything that we get to vote on or have to vote on. And this is an example of it. I think those of you who agree with the idea that Congress should pass comprehensive reform, I would ask you, have you thought about what federalism means and how it plays into this? Do you know what might be in that? Would it intrude on what you like about Colorado's system? I know we identify a couple other states where we don't live, and we don't have authority over those states, but do you know what Congress would pass? I don't. And as a political observation, as I recall, there's one party that controls the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate and the White House. It's the same party that controls the governor's office, the state house, and the state senate here. So if you want to encourage members of that party to do what they can do, I think on their own, why not write a letter to them and invite people to sign on to it? You could do that. But instead, we have a memorial here that indicates that we, I think that means all of us in the Senate, agree to all of these things in the memorial. And I need to come up and just share with you, it's not new. I don't. I didn't in 2013 and I don't in 2014. But this isn't an opportunity to fix either of those, what I consider to be deficiencies in our voting process. And I don't think that shoring up those, having some better mechanism to reduce the number of ballots that are mailed out to people who don't actually live there, and to address some sort of documentation, evidence that a person actually is residing in a district, or even if it were the same day, that would be better than, I think I want to, I intend to. Because as we've discussed, debated before, with a statement of intent, if plans change, there's a job or a divorce or a childbirth or a death or whatever, and someone's life changes and they say, you know, I intended to live there and I voted there, but I never actually did. I think that's still okay because that was their intent. And those are the two reasons, the ballots and the statement of intent, that I can't endorse this, I can't vote yes and send a message out to our congressional delegation or all 100 members of the U.S. Senate, 435 voting members of the U.S. House, all 535 of them. I can't send the message that, yeah, everything works great in Colorado and I want you to do that in other states, because those two issues prevent me from saying that. So I will be a respectful no on the memorial. Thank you, Mr. President.
Having no further discussion, the motion before the body is the adoption of Senate Memorial 22. A roll call vote has been requested. Mr. Panetta, will you please poll the members?
Bridges. Bridges, aye. Buckner. Buckner, aye. Coleman. Coleman, aye. Cook. No. Cook, no. Quorum. Quorum, no. Danielson excused. Donovan. Donovan, aye. Finberg. Finberg, aye. Fields. Fields, aye. Gardner. Gardner, no. Janal. Janal, aye. Gonzalez. Gonzalez, aye. Hanson. Hanson, aye. Heisey.
No.
Heisey, no. Holbert. Holbert, no. Hawkins Lewis. Hawkins Lewis, aye. Kirkmeyer. No. Kirkmeyer, no. Colker. Colker, aye. Lee. Lee, aye. Liston.
No.
Liston, no. Lundeen. Lundeen, no. Moreno. Moreno, aye. Pedersen.
Aye.
Pedersen, aye. Priola. Priola, aye. Rankin. Rankin, no. Rodriguez. Rodriguez, aye. Scott.
No.
Scott, no. Simpson.
No.
Simpson, no. Smallwood. Smallwood, no. Sonnenberg. Sonnenberg, no. Story.
Aye.
Story, aye. Winter.
Aye.
Winter, aye. Woodward excused. Zenzinger. Zenzinger, aye. Mr. President.
Aye.
Mr. President, aye.
With 20 ayes, 13 no votes, 0 absent, and 2 excused, Senate Memorial 22 is adopted. Co-sponsors, Senators Moreno, Hansen, Coleman, Hawkes Lewis, Zenzinger, Bridges, the Majority Leader, Buckner, Lee, Janol, Winter, Story, Fields, Kolker, Rodriguez, Donovan. Please add the President. Announcements. Senator Gonzalez.
Gracias, Presidente. Colleagues, upon adjournment of our, with our colleagues in the House completing their floor work, the Senate State, Veterans, and Military Affairs Committee will be meeting in the old Supreme Court. 15 minutes upon adjournment of the floor from their floor work, we will be having our joint committee for our SMART Act hearing. Thank you all very much.
Senator Coleman, followed by Senator Priola.
Thank you, Mr. President. I've been asked to make a notice that tonight's Society of Eye Physicians and Surgeons legislative reception will be postponed until a later date determined given rising Omicron infection rates. Thank you.
Senator Priola.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, I need to ask to be excused Friday morning to attend a funeral. I will try to make it back if there are committees in the afternoon.
Senator Priola, I presume that you have consulted with the Majority Leader and Minority Leader. If so, you have...
I will after I ask this question.
Senator Priola will be marked excused. Senator Rankin.
Mr. President, I ask to be excused tomorrow for medical reasons. I've consulted with the appropriate powers that be.
Wonderful. Members, the script used to say, I have consulted with the Minority Leader and the Majority Leader and request permission. I don't even know it because I've never asked for it. But Senator Rankin, you will be marked excused for tomorrow, which is the 19th. Senator Sonberg.
Thank you, Mr. President. Appropriately on my left, my good friend. We are still begging for money for the National Western Stock Show. That auction is Friday. I can tell you that my side over here, not to challenge you, on second thought, yeah, I'm challenging you. We have just under $2,000 raised on my side of the aisle in the Senate. We could use your help, and I'm still not letting people off the hook on my side of the aisle, but we could use your help to provide funding for livestock for these youth and their future.
Senator Donovan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you to my colleagues. Yes, on this side of the chamber, we have barely crossed 300. That's 300. So have quite a long ways to go to meet our goals of both sides bipartisanly supporting this effort. I will also add, I was out there this weekend. It is remarkable what they are doing out there. If you guys haven't had a chance, please talk to one of us. We'd love to set up a chance for you to see the really neat future of ag that's happening over there. But the storyline also had this as perhaps a postscript on it. It is, the yards are not as busy as they have been. The stalls where people bring their prized animals to sell, to show off to the nation as the National Western. Why? Because there's lingering concern over if Colorado is still welcoming to the livestock industry and what it means to feed the world as someone who raises beef or sheep or pig or goat. And it would just be a remarkable message if we can relay as leaders of this state how much we value these folks. And one way to do that is to show up strong at the Junior Livestock, which is really one of the more visible events of the year, and make sure that Oklahoma City doesn't continue to distract and earn more business than we have, because this stock show is important to so many people. So an important year to show our support in a bipartisan way, and hope you guys can all contribute. We have just hours, we have 72 hours left to do this, guys. It happened fast this year. And because it is a nonprofit, you can write checks from your campaign account in whatever amount you feel comfortable in contributing.
Senator Sonderberg.
Thank you, Mr. President. And one last thing, if you would like to make it tomorrow as a gesture, because the rodeo queens will be here tomorrow morning, I'm fine with that. Take your money back, and you're more than happy to give it tomorrow, but it costs you double tomorrow to do it while the rodeo queens are here. And it should be noted, Rodeo America happened to be in the chamber last year, sitting right over there as Miss Rodeo Colorado. Just a plug. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Janol.
Thank you, Mr. President. Tomorrow, we will have a joint Senate Local Government Committee meeting upon adjournment, and that will be in the Old State Library. So just, I'll repeat it again tomorrow, but just wanted to let you all know ahead of time. Thanks.
Leader Holbert.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, you know I am a hockey fan, and I just wanted to give a shout out to the Colorado Avalanche, who are now #1 in the Western Conference. 14 wins at home. Tune in and cheer for our Colorado Avalanche. Go Avs! Thank you, Mr. President.
Having no further discussions or announcements, Mr. Majority Leader. Senator Pedersen is recognized.
Thank you. Sorry, I had technology difficulties there. Thank you, Mr. President. Members, the joint finance meeting will be upon adjournment in the old Supreme Court chamber. See you there.
Mr. Majority Leader.
Julie, since state affairs is in the open state court, she just said finance. It says there in the old state library, but she said it's the old Supreme Court.
Senator Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just to clarify, State Affairs will be meeting upon adjournment of both the Senate and the House in the old Supreme Court, and Joint Finance will be meeting in the old State Library upon adjournment of both the House and Senate. Thank you very much.
Mr. Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. And just so it's clear as mud, some of the members of the morning committee are also on the afternoon committees. And in the event that the morning committees are not finished because the House will be adjourning later than we are, then the afternoon committee will start upon adjournment of the committee prior to it, if there's overlap membership or the same room or something like that. So pay attention to if the committee before you is running late, and that would mean your afternoon committee will begin essentially after that committee has completed. Let us know if you have questions, and we'll help problem solve for you. Mr. President, we may have some bills to read across, so we'll keep the desk open for a little bit. Move the Senate recess until noon today.
You have heard the motion. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the Senate will stay in a recess until 1200 hours today.